Hi, my name is Olivia Gonzalez, and I'm your host of Op-Ed Live. Welcome to this week's episode on drone strikes and extrajudicial killings. Here we have two panelists to discuss the topic with us. Would you care to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Gregory Wilbur. I'm a third-year student at NYU Law. My research interests there focus on the law of national security, and I also served 4 years in the Marine Corps prior to law school.
Welcome.
And I'm Sam Natali. I'm a first year at NYU Law School, and I'm pursuing a career in defense of people who are prosecuted for terrorism and related crimes.
Well, thank you both for being here today. I guess we'll dive into our first question. What kind of gray areas or problems do you think that the legal system has now for dealing with drone strikes or targeted killings?
Well, the easiest point of grayness within the system is what happens when you have to, or the state decides it has to kill an American citizen. Obviously, within our Constitution, there are due process requirements that the state has to take before they can deprive you of something as critical as life. In those situations where the state wants to go ahead and take the life without that sort of process, what process exists is a really difficult question. Currently, according to the memo leaked by the DOJ, due process is satisfied when a CIA officer says that it's satisfied, when they have made a private decision that this person can be terminated, which is what happened with Anwar al-Awlaki. However, it's unclear whether that is either constitutionally supported or is the right thing from a policy perspective, and if it's ethical besides that. But even if you're operating outside of that kind of due process sphere, which is what the Bush administration did, where they said, well, it's a battlefield, the world's a battlefield, and if you're on the wrong side of the battle, we'll kill you. That may, in some ways, do less damage to this idea of due process, but on the other hand, is uncomfortably broad. And given that there have been neither prosecutions nor much investigation the way that the Bush administration has done these things, or how the Obama administration has carried on these programs, there is a lot of unknown ground in which it's very unclear whether what the government is doing is legal.
What are your thoughts on the protections that should or shouldn't be in place, specifically for U.S. citizens who may be targets of drone strikes?
Well, I think the main point's been hit on, which is that the question is who is allowed to make the determination that somebody is subject to an extrajudicial killing. And right now the administration is saying that decision is entirely within the executive branch. It's not clear to me that due process requires being outside of the executive branch, but it's clear that when you have congressmen feeling as though they don't have the right information for the legal rationale behind killing, and you have courts, in large part by their own choice, out of it completely, I think at the very least the administration owes more to explain the legal rationale behind their decision-making and to give Congress a chance to weigh in on the processes being used. Whether that process can actually extend outside the executive branch or will occur within the executive branch, but according to rules that Congress helps develop, is a question for later, but I think the question needs to come up.
What kinds of arguments do you think that are most powerful for and against a drone strike that would end in a killing?
Well, you have to remember that the majority of drone strikes aren't for American citizens. Most of them are for either targeted attacks on a particular al-Qaeda commander that we want to get rid of, or alternatively something called signature strike, which is where they match a very generalized profile of a type of person. In many cases, it's been extended as broadly as anyone over the age of 14 who's a male in the combat zone is a militant, is a terrorist. We can kill them, right? So, so I think there's, even within people who broadly support drone strikes, those kind of programs are really unpopular, to put it mildly. But within the framework of killing an American citizen, there are lots of arguments that say, well, it's very hard to get boots on the ground. It's dangerous to American soldiers to put boots on the ground, that drones may be more accurate and more precise by using a smaller warhead and by waiting and loitering over the area in order to get that right strike. You may be able to reduce casualties. I think that the better argument is the argument against drone strikes, which is where, while there may be legitimate uses of drone strikes, as with any government power, if you think that there's a significant capacity for abuse, especially given the secrecy with the program, especially given the CIA's past indiscretions with regards to what is legal and what is ethical in the way that they fought this war, it may not be worthwhile to give this power up, or at least without, as he said, more involvement from Congress and more public oversight.
How would you come down on this deliberative problem of putting boots on the ground or engaging in a drone strike for practical, policy, or legal reasons?
Well, I think it again comes back to what power of the United States you think we're exercising. If we're saying that we're launching drone strikes on people to enforce the criminal code, we've got a lot of problems with that. But that's not what the government's saying. They're saying we're doing these drone strikes as prosecuting a war. And I don't think there's any obligation under current law to capture people. The government has laid it out as one of their conditions for an American citizen. I'm not really sure what's that's based on. In the war framework, there's no obligation to capture unless somebody surrenders or is clearly out of combat. That said, the question of whether we continue that war framework is a very worthy one right now, considering that it's been 10 years plus since 9/11, and Al-Qaeda seems to have much smaller ambitions and reach than they did before.
And that war framework seems to not only be difficult to apply, but especially in the case of American citizens, where Anwar al-Awlaki, although the DOJ memo is specifically an authorization for the use of this drone strike force on people who are senior al-Qaeda operational officials, it's unclear that al-Awlaki would have made the cut under that sort of definition. And if that's true, if he may have been operating as likely other Americans who'd be the target of this program are, as more of a supporter, as more of a propagandist, as more of a voice in support, saying that, well, you could kill them as if they had a uniform on, seems to be a legal fiction at best.
So do you think the legal debate comes down ultimately, does it boil down to a question of definition? What is a terrorist? Who counts as a senior operative in Al-Qaeda? Or where do you think the line is there?
I don't think it should come down just to a question of definitions, because one, the term terrorist is uncomfortably vague in the extreme. And two, that if the government is setting its own definitions, then it seems like no check at all in the power for them to set the lines for themselves and then define what falls within those categories. I don't think the legal question is one about definitions. I think that there is a valid legal question about what is the law of war on the subject, which is totally unsettled. But if you are going to treat it as more of a criminal action, I think that the criminal framework may be a much better way of dealing with terrorism, much like other kinds of violence that happen not directly between states. If you're going to use that framework, then you come up against very difficult due process issues in which you may well have an obligation to capture somebody because you have to give them a process to even determine what their level of guilt is, or at the very least you would need some sort of adversarial process wherein their interests can be represented besides just a CIA official say so.
I'd also love to hear your thoughts on that same question, but also keeping the ethical and legal arguments in mind, I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on the restrictions and regulations that should be in place for engaging in a targeted killing in a drone strike.
Well, I think the definitional issue is actually very important because, unfortunately, the war framework kind of forces you into definitional issues because you're deciding who you can and cannot target based on their classification. Law enforcement is very individuated by contrast. We're assigning guilt to a person for what they've done, and we're going to punish them for it. And so I think the big moral question is whether we're comfortable in a situation where the classifications are not easy to make, letting those classifications being made entirely by administration procedures and entirely within the administration with total secrecy, whether we're comfortable with that. And I think from an ethical standpoint, I don't think we as a society are doing our duty to the rest of the world when we allow that to happen.
What kind of considerations do you think we should keep in mind as we make those kinds of calls?
I think because the classification is inevitable, as long as there's a sustained debate about how we're conducting that classification, and then what the real consequences are of that classification, that I'm comfortable with that point, but we haven't even begun to get into those things. It's all been internal, and there's been no dialogue.
Yeah, the fact that it's internal, I'm not convinced that an entirely internal process would be sufficient, but there are ways of conducting internal processes that would be vastly superior to what we're doing now. One particular option is called using a red team, which is somebody who within the administration plays devil's advocate for the other side. Some kind of adversarial system here would seem to be at a basic level requirement. Though I am not persuaded that the operation is so delicate that we couldn't have significantly more information about the nature of the program coming to light and these deliberations happening, if not by a federal judge, certainly with some sort of public record open to amount of scrutiny, that we can then talk about this. But as it is now with the level of secrecy, you can't even say sue about the program because its very existence is a state secret. That seems untenable, and if we want to mitigate the horrible effects of the program, we need to open it up to the bodies that we have that act as checks on government abuse.
Any final remarks on your end on that note?
The final remark I would make is that remember that drones are a platform, and that when we're talking about the legal and ethical consequences of deciding to kill people outside of the judicial system, that it can be done through a variety of means.
Thank you both very much for joining us, and thank you for watching. Email all questions and comments to opinion@nyunews.com.